Steve adjusted his tie as he strolled down the jet bridge, heading toward the plane that would take him from New York to Los Angeles. It had been a long week. He'd just secured a major promotion at work, a milestone he'd been gunning for months. His briefcase felt heavier in his hand as he moved through the first-class line, the excitement bubbling inside him. Tonight, he would be sleeping in a luxurious hotel suite, waking up to sunny California and a few days of unwinding before the next wave of corporate deadlines hit. But as he stepped onto the plane, something unusual caught his eye. There, sitting across from the window, was a familiar face. A face Steve had seen on billboards, in movies, and plastered across every magazine rack he passed. Keanu Reeves. The man who had graced the big screen in countless action-packed films. The man who had somehow managed to be loved by nearly everyone but, in Steve's eyes, was just another overpaid actor, riding on the wave of his fame from a few decades ago. Of course, he's in first class, Steve muttered to himself. Where else would a guy like him sit? He had never met Keanu personally, but that didn't stop Steve from feeling a strange mix of disdain and envy. How could someone like Keanu, who never seemed to age and was revered by millions, ever know what it was like to actually struggle? To work hard for something and still feel like it's never enough? To look in the mirror and question whether any of his achievements even mattered? No, Steve thought. Keanu Reeves was just another actor who had hit it big and never had to worry about paying rent or fixing a broken pipe. He was a movie star, living in his Hollywood bubble, detached from the real world. As Steve slid into his first-class seat, he couldn't help but steal a few more glances toward Keanu. The man was reading a book, completely absorbed, his calm demeanor the exact opposite of Steve's own racing thoughts. Steve's eyes narrowed as he watched Keanu, so relaxed, so effortlessly cool. Well, this should be fun, Steve mumbled under his breath, leaning back in his seat and adjusting his sunglasses. He tapped the button for the flight attendant, ordered a drink, and let the minutes tick by. He could hear the soft murmur of other passengers talking about Keanu, how they had seen him in this movie or that one, how great he was in The Matrix or John Wick. Steve felt his jaw tighten as the chatter continued. "Oh, great," he muttered, shaking his head. It's like he's some kind of god. There was a small part of Steve that wanted to be part of the conversation, to join in and express admiration for the actor, as so many others were doing. But another part of him couldn't stand the idea of agreeing with the crowd. Instead, he leaned into his usual sarcasm and bitterness, determined to make a point. Without thinking too much about it, he turned to the woman seated next to him, a fellow first-class passenger, and said, "Keanu Reeves? Honestly, that guy's just a relic of the past. He's made a career out of playing the same character over and over. The stoic, mysterious action hero. I mean, come on, there's no range there. It's like they put him in every movie and call it cool." The woman raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Steve, emboldened by her silence, kept going, clearly trying to impress her with his cynical perspective. He doesn't even seem to try. People just eat it up because he's got this nice guy persona going on. I mean, if people really knew who he was, I bet they'd stop worshiping him. No depth, just a pretty face in a suit. Steve snorted, taking a sip of his drink. Keanu, oblivious to the conversation just a few feet away, continued to read, his face calm and unbothered. But in the quiet of the cabin, Steve's words hung in the air. He didn't know it yet, but this conversation, his dismissal of Keanu, his attempt to belittle the actor, was about to change the course of his life. But Steve didn't care. He was feeling superior, convinced that his life was grounded in reality, while Keanu's world seemed detached from it. And for a moment, Steve thought he had the upper hand. Little did he know, the man he had just insulted was far closer to him than he realized. And by the end of this flight, Steve would have a truth revealed to him that would turn everything he believed about fame, humility, and self-worth upside down. As the plane took off, the hum of the engines blending with the quiet chatter of passengers, Steve felt a rush of adrenaline, not just from the flight, but from the smugness of having made his point. He smiled to himself. This would be a story he'd tell when he got back to his friends. But Steve had no idea what was coming next. Steve leaned back in his seat, the soft leather cushioning of first class feeling like a small victory, a reminder of how far he had come. But as the plane began its climb into the sky, his mind wandered back to a time when things weren't so easy. It wasn't always about the corner office or the promotions. It wasn't always about escaping New York's suffocating rush to a place where the sun always seemed to shine. There was a time when Steve was just another kid trying to get by. Raised in a small town outside Boston, he had never been the most popular or the most athletic. He wasn't the guy who was voted most likely to succeed in high school. But he'd always been determined, always made himself believe that if he just worked hard enough, if he just pushed a little harder than everyone else, he could make something of himself. His parents had worked long hours. His father was a mechanic and his mother a waitress. They didn't have much, but they provided enough. There were days Steve sat alone in his room, listening to his father's muttered frustrations about money and his mother's tired sighs when she came home late at night. He'd spent those nights dreaming of a better life, a life where he didn't have to worry about bills or barely scraping by. But even then, even when he was younger and more hopeful, he'd noticed something. People like Keanu, people who had it all, never seemed to struggle. They lived in the world of made it, of luxury, of fame and fortune. They seemed to just glide through life while people like him, like his parents, had to fight for every inch. Steve had always been smart enough to understand that it wasn't just about luck. It was about being in the right place at the right time. It was about knowing the right people, playing the game. He had gotten the job at a prestigious marketing firm in Manhattan through sheer persistence, working longer hours than anyone else, staying late, sacrificing weekends, his own happiness. His friends from college would say he had made it, but Steve never felt that way. The truth was, even as he climbed the corporate ladder, Steve had always felt like an outsider, constantly trying to prove himself. It wasn't about the work anymore. It was about the validation. He craved it. He longed for it like a hungry man longing for his next meal. The truth hurt. It was never enough. Steve's marriage to Emily, his college sweetheart, had fallen apart 2 years ago, a casualty of his obsession with career success. He remembered the argument clearly, how she'd sat across from him one night at their favorite dinner spot and told him, "Steve, you're always working. You're always so busy trying to climb. But where does it end? Where do we fit into all of this?" He hadn't had an answer for her, and she had left. She couldn't do it anymore. The silence that followed felt like a void in his life. His work took over. The long hours replaced his empty home. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was just that he didn't know how to balance it all. He didn't know how to make his own happiness without using success as a crutch. As he looked out the window of the plane, Steve thought about the things he had sacrificed. Family, love, friends, peace of mind. He thought about how he'd distanced himself from his brother, Mark, who had always been the more carefree of the two. Mark had moved to Denver after college, living a quieter, simpler life, away from the frantic pace of the corporate world. Steve never understood why Mark didn't care about climbing the ladder. Mark never seemed to care about making it. And now, here he was, in first class on a flight to LA, a success by society's standards. But it felt hollow. He glanced again at Keanu, sitting across the aisle, lost in his book. What was it about people like him? Keanu had it all, the fame, the fortune, the adoration. Steve assumed Keanu was like everyone else in Hollywood, surrounded by sycophants and luxury, detached from the real world. But what did he really know about Keanu? Nothing. And that's when it hit him. Steve didn't know the first thing about the struggles of the people he judged. Keanu's fame, his calm demeanor. Those were just layers, not the whole story. Steve had spent so much of his life looking at celebrities like Keanu through a lens of envy and resentment, thinking they had it all figured out. But maybe, just maybe, there was more to Keanu's story. Maybe, beneath that quiet exterior, Keanu had faced battles of his own. Steve wasn't sure why he was even thinking this way. He wasn't the type of guy to suddenly empathize with someone he had spent the last hour mocking in his head. But there was a lingering curiosity, a nagging question he couldn't shake. What if he was wrong about Keanu? What if, just for once, he had made the wrong judgment? The thought gnawed at him, but he quickly pushed it aside. He wasn't going to go soft on himself now, not when he had worked so hard to be where he was. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Mark. "Hey, how's the flight? Don't forget, we need to talk when you get back. Big changes ahead." "Big changes ahead," Steve muttered to himself, replying quickly, "Let's talk soon. I'm sure it's nothing." He put the phone down, the conversation still on his mind as he stared out the window. Keanu was still reading. Steve took another long sip of his drink and sighed, wondering how long it would take him to truly understand the things he had been missing all these years. The flight had just started, and there was no telling where this journey would take him. The plane hummed along smoothly, cruising thousands of feet above the ground. But Steve's mind was anything but calm. The thoughts he had been trying to push away were now impossible to ignore. He glanced across the aisle again, catching sight of Keanu as he turned a page in his book, completely oblivious to the tension brewing in Steve's chest. "Why does this guy bug me so much?" Steve muttered under his breath, trying to focus on the business emails he had pulled up on his phone. It wasn't like him to be this distracted, but he couldn't help it. The whole flight was turning into a game of comparison. And so far, Keanu seemed to have everything Steve wanted, but never felt like he could fully grasp. Peace, contentment, ease. Keanu was the guy who had made it and never had to sacrifice anything for it. Or so Steve thought. As the flight wore on, the small talk among passengers seemed to center around Keanu, where they'd seen him, what they'd heard about him. Steve couldn't escape it. He could hear a group of passengers a few rows behind him giggling as they whispered about the movies they loved him in, reminiscing about iconic scenes from The Matrix or Speed. A few people even posed for selfies near him, as if the mere proximity to a star somehow elevated their own status. Does it ever stop? Steve muttered to himself, rolling his eyes. His mind began to spiral. Why did people idolize him? What was so special about an actor who had simply been in the right place at the right time? Steve had worked harder than anyone he knew. Longer hours, more sacrifices, and yet he still had to fight for recognition. No one cared about Steve. They cared about Keanu, the guy who could breeze through life with a quiet smile and effortlessly capture the attention of everyone around him. "I bet he doesn't even get it," Steve muttered as he took another drink, his thoughts growing darker. How easy he has it. It wasn't the first time Steve had felt this way. Every achievement he'd made had felt like a battle won against an invisible enemy. But now, here on this flight, Keanu Reeves embodied everything Steve resented. He was the symbol of what Steve could never reach, the representation of a life Steve had worked hard to resent. And it didn't help that Keanu, this untouchable figure, was sitting there, completely unaffected by the attention around him. He wasn't showing any signs of arrogance or pride. In fact, he looked peaceful. His expression was calm, focused entirely on his book, as though the world around him was a distant hum. Steve clenched his jaw. The thought that Keanu's cool demeanor was somehow a show of superiority made his blood boil. So much of Steve's identity was tied to his own ambition, his own climb. But seeing Keanu so comfortable, so untainted, made him feel like everything he'd worked for was meaningless. "That's it," Steve whispered, his voice low but determined. "I can't stand it anymore." He stood up abruptly, startling a few passengers, and started to walk toward the front of the plane, making sure to pass Keanu's seat. As he neared the aisle, Steve caught Keanu's eyes for the briefest moment. Keanu looked up, a soft, polite smile curving at the edges of his lips. The smile wasn't one of recognition, just a neutral, almost warm acknowledgement of Steve's presence. That was it. That small, polite smile made Steve feel even smaller, as if Keanu was somehow pitying him, as if Steve's existence didn't even warrant a second glance. It didn't help that everyone else seemed to be fawning over him, whispering behind their hands, taking pictures like he was some kind of god. With a sudden surge of anger, Steve did something impulsive. He leaned in slightly, just enough for Keanu to hear him. "Must be nice, huh? Living off your fame, doing the same thing over and over." Keanu's smile faltered for the briefest moment, but he didn't respond. He just blinked and gave Steve a polite nod, then turned his gaze back to his book. That only fueled Steve's frustration. "That's it, huh? No response? Guess you don't have much to say when you're living in a bubble, do you?" Keanu looked up again, his expression neutral, but there was a slight sadness in his eyes. "I'm sorry if you feel that way," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I didn't mean to make you upset." Steve stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. Was he really about to argue with Keanu Reeves? This wasn't how he'd imagined it. He had come here to enjoy his flight, to relax. But now, it felt like the entire moment had spun out of control. Steve, for a fleeting second, wondered whether he should walk away. He should have just let it go. But his pride wouldn't let him. Not when he had spent so much time resenting what Keanu stood for. "No," Steve snapped. "I'm just saying, it's not real. You're just pretending." And people fall for it because they want to believe in something that's not true. Keanu put the book down, his eyes no longer focused on Steve's words but searching his face, almost as if trying to understand the emotion behind them. "I think you're mistaken," Keanu said quietly. "Nothing's ever quite what it seems. You'd be surprised what people like me go through, too." Steve blinked, thrown off by the unexpected response. What did Keanu mean by that? Was this some kind of celebrity humility act? Was he playing a part? Or was there something more to this quiet man that Steve had never considered? Before Steve could respond, the flight attendant arrived with a drink cart, effectively interrupting the moment. Steve took a step back, still seething but now unsure of himself. He turned away, making his way back to his seat. The anger that had driven him to confront Keanu now felt misplaced. He didn't know why, but something about Keanu's calm demeanor, his quiet confidence, had shaken Steve. Something about the way Keanu had handled the exchange made Steve question everything he thought he knew. As the cart moved down the aisle, Steve's thoughts whirled. Maybe there was more to Keanu than just a pretty face in Hollywood. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, but Steve couldn't help but wonder, what did Keanu mean by that? The tension in the cabin was palpable as Steve sat back down in his seat. He clenched his fists, staring at the small TV screen in front of him, his mind still racing. The moment with Keanu replayed in his head, over and over again. There was something about Keanu's words, the quietness of his response, that refused to leave Steve's thoughts. What had Keanu meant by, "You'd be surprised what people like me go through too"? The phrase echoed in Steve's mind, gnawing at him. Steve had always assumed that people like Keanu, those with fame and wealth, had it easy. They were untouchable, living a life free of struggle, far removed from the grind of everyday people. But what if he was wrong? For a moment, Steve wondered if this was the universe giving him a lesson. He had spent years chasing success, working harder than anyone else, all in the name of climbing higher, getting noticed, earning validation. But had he ever stopped to think about the journey of others? Did anyone, not just him, struggle with their own battles? Or was Steve so caught up in his own sense of entitlement that he forgot to look beyond himself? The question lingered, unsettling him. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. Steve couldn't focus on work, couldn't focus on anything except the nagging feeling that something fundamental was shifting inside him. By the time the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Steve had come to a strange conclusion. There was more to Keanu than he had realized. But that realization only raised more questions. The plane touched down, and passengers began to stir, unbuckling their seatbelts and grabbing their carry-ons. As Steve stood up, ready to exit, he caught a glimpse of Keanu again. This time, though, it wasn't a glance filled with judgment. Steve looked at him, and Keanu, seemingly without a second thought, gave him another quiet nod, the same soft, unbothered smile. Steve felt a strange shift in his chest, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Humility. He gathered his things and exited the plane, his mind still reeling, his heart slightly heavier than before. He had spent so much time focusing on success, on how to outdo others, how to stay one step ahead. But for the first time in a long while, Steve wondered if he had been missing something much more important, the human connection. The airport terminal was bustling with the usual chaos of people coming and going. Steve moved through the crowds, heading toward baggage claim, still trying to shake off the weight of the conversation with Keanu. The more he thought about it, the more he realized just how easy it had been to judge people like him. Celebrities, wealthy individuals, the ones who seemed to have it all. But what did Steve really know about their lives? About their struggles? His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was another message from Mark. Where are you? We need to talk. Big stuff going on. Meet me at the hotel when you land. Steve rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the tension. He had been putting off a conversation with Mark for weeks now, one that he knew would be uncomfortable, but necessary. Mark had always been the free spirit, living his life in a way Steve couldn't understand. The two of them had drifted apart over the years, each living in a different world. But now, it seemed like the universe was pushing Steve towards something he wasn't quite ready for. He sighed, glancing around the airport before he walked to the baggage claim. And then he saw him, Keanu. He was standing near the baggage claim carousel, surrounded by a small group of people who were clearly trying to get his attention. Keanu wasn't saying much, his hands tucked casually in the pockets of his jacket, a slight smile on his face. But it was the way he carried himself that caught Steve's attention. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't aloofness. There was a quiet confidence, a peace in Keanu's demeanor that Steve envied. It was as though he wasn't concerned with the chaos around him, the noise of the airport, or the people trying to get his autograph. He was simply there. Steve paused for a moment, watching from a distance. He almost felt embarrassed by his earlier outburst on the plane. What had he been thinking? Was he really so quick to judge? The flight had been a strange one, and now it felt like a turning point. Maybe it wasn't just about success anymore. Maybe it was about something deeper, something Steve had been missing all along. A voice behind him jolted Steve from his thoughts. "Hey, Steve." He turned around to see Mark waving at him from a distance, his laid-back, California casual style a stark contrast to Steve's own polished, corporate look. Mark's easy smile made Steve feel immediately at ease, even though he knew the conversation ahead wasn't going to be easy. "Let's go grab a drink," Mark said, stepping toward him. "We've got a lot to talk about." Steve nodded, following his brother toward the exit. As they walked, Mark's voice drifted into Steve's ears, but his thoughts kept wandering back to Keanu. It wasn't just the quiet confidence Steve had noticed. It was the way Keanu moved through the world, unbothered by the spotlight, unchassed by the approval of others. Keanu didn't need to prove anything to anyone, and that was something Steve was starting to understand. Maybe that's what he had been missing all this time. The evening sun hung low in the Los Angeles sky as Steve and Mark made their way through the bustling streets. The weight of the day, of everything that had unfolded on the plane, still lingered in Steve's mind. He hadn't been able to shake the conversation with Keanu, and now, with Mark's unexpected message pulling him in a new direction, he wasn't sure where he stood anymore. "Man, what's going on with you lately?" Mark asked, glancing over at Steve. "You seem off. You've been working yourself into the ground, and now, here you are looking like you just stepped out of a storm." Steve hesitated for a moment. His first instinct was to brush it off, to act like everything was fine. But he couldn't. Not after the encounter with Keanu. Not after feeling this strange shift inside him. "You ever wonder if you're just chasing the wrong thing?" Steve asked, his voice quieter than usual. Mark raised an eyebrow, surprised by the depth of Steve's question. "What do you mean?" Steve sighed. He could feel the weight of his own words as they left his mouth. "I've spent my entire life chasing success, chasing approval, but I don't know anymore. I thought I had it all figured out. And then today, I met Keanu Reeves on the plane." Mark's eyes widened, a grin spreading across his face. "Keanu? What happened? You didn't get into some ridiculous celebrity argument, did you?" Steve shook his head, a rueful smile tugging at his lips. "I did, and I'm embarrassed about it." Mark's expression softened. "I take it he didn't take the bait, huh?" "No," Steve admitted. "He didn't. I've spent my whole life thinking that people like him, celebrities, the ones with everything, have it easy. But something about him, the way he carries himself, made me realize I've been wrong. He didn't get defensive. He didn't try to show me up. He just let it go." Mark nodded slowly, absorbing Steve's words. "And what do you think that means for you?" "I don't know," Steve said, his voice tight. "I think I've been so focused on what I think I need, on what I thought success would feel like, that I never stopped to think about what actually matters. People like Keanu don't seem to chase success the way I do. They live their lives, and success comes with it. Maybe I've been too obsessed with the wrong things. Mark clapped a hand on Steve's shoulder, his tone lighter now. You know, maybe that's the first step. Realizing that chasing fame or money, or whatever you think will make you happy, won't get you anywhere. But there's something else you need to figure out. What do you want? Steve looked at his brother, the weight of the question sinking in. I think I've been so afraid of not having it all together that I've forgotten how to just live. Mark smiled knowingly. That's the real trick, isn't it? We're all just trying to figure it out, one day at a time. But you're right. You can't live in the rat race forever. Sometimes, you've got to stop and figure out why you're even running in the first place. The two walked in silence for a few moments as they neared the bar Mark had chosen for them. Steve's thoughts kept circling back to Keanu. His calm, steady demeanor, his complete lack of concern over Steve's accusations. There was something powerful about that quiet strength. Something that felt so foreign to Steve, who had always fought for every inch of recognition. As they entered the dimly lit bar, the noise of laughter and chatter surrounded them, but Steve's mind was still elsewhere. Mark led the way to a corner booth, where they sat, each with a drink in hand. Steve took a deep breath, still feeling the pull of the day's events. So, what now? Steve asked, his voice a little hesitant. Mark leaned back in his seat, his fingers tapping against the glass. Well, for starters, I think you need to stop beating yourself up. You've been pushing yourself for so long, trying to prove something to the world, but maybe the real lesson here is that you don't need to prove anything to anyone. You just need to be you. Steve stared at his drink, the words sinking in. For so long, he had been running from one goal to the next, never really stopping to think about what he wanted out of life. It had always been about getting to the next milestone, the next promotion, the next recognition. But now, sitting here with his brother, he realized that there had to be more to life than just success. You're right, Steve said quietly. I've been so focused on winning that I've lost sight of what I really want. I don't know what that is yet, but I think I need to figure it out. I can't keep going on like this. Mark's smile was warm, and there was a spark of pride in his eyes. That's the first step, man. You've already got the hardest part figured out. Now, you just need to take it one day at a time. As the conversation continued, Steve felt a strange sense of calm settling over him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't focused on the fight to get ahead. Instead, he was starting to understand that maybe the key to happiness wasn't in the hustle, but in the moments of stillness. It was about finding peace within himself, not in the approval of others. But little did Steve know, this was just the beginning of a much deeper journey, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, happiness, and his own identity. The days that followed Steve's conversation with Mark felt strangely lighter. It was as though a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted. For the first time in years, Steve began to step back and reflect on his life. Not from the perspective of a man constantly chasing the next big thing, but as someone who had the opportunity to breathe, to really think about what he wanted, not just what he thought he should want. Over the next week, Steve took a break from the chaos of his career. He put down his phone, turned off the constant notifications, and stopped obsessively checking emails. For the first time, he felt the freedom to just exist without the pressure of doing something all the time. Someone recorded the entire exchange. The moment you got in Keanu's face. It's all over social media now. People are freaking out about it. There's a ton of comments, memes, everything. It's insane. The phone buzzed in his hand as his assistant sent him a link. Steve clicked it hesitantly, unsure of what he was about to see. As the video loaded, his stomach churned. There it was, his angry outburst on the plane. The comments from passengers around him were audible, and Steve could hear his own voice, filled with judgment and arrogance. But then, something strange happened. Keanu's calm, composed response was there too. His ability to remain unruffled, his quiet strength, stood out starkly against Steve's outburst. It was as though the video captured the exact moment when Steve's world had cracked open, revealing a deeper truth he hadn't been willing to see. And that was the moment that shifted everything. The comments below the video flooded in, but it wasn't what Steve expected. Instead of ridicule, there was an overwhelming wave of support for Keanu. People praised him for staying calm and collected, for handling the situation with grace. But it was the comments about Steve that struck him the most. He didn't even need to fight back. He just showed what real strength is. That's how we should all respond, without anger, without trying to prove something. The more Steve read, the more he realized something. Keanu had done more for him than just teach him about humility. He had taught Steve about the kind of man he wanted to become. Keanu's response hadn't been about winning or losing. It had been about letting go of the need to defend himself, the need to prove something, the need to fight. And that lesson had reached people. It had reached Steve. As he sat there, absorbing the flood of messages, Steve felt something click deep inside of him. He wasn't going to be defined by that one embarrassing moment. He was going to rise from it, stronger and more self-aware, just like Keanu had done. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real lesson. The next morning, Steve stood in front of his mirror, staring at the man he had become. He wasn't perfect, and he never would be. But he had learned something incredibly important. Success wasn't about titles or recognition. It was about living with authenticity, treating people with respect, and owning your mistakes without fear. And as the morning sun streamed through the window, Steve made a promise to himself. He would live a life that was defined by kindness, humility, and a quiet strength that came from knowing who he truly was. It had been a few weeks since Steve's epiphany, and the sense of peace he'd found in his life had only grown. Every day felt a little more deliberate, a little more mindful. He had started to distance himself from the constant drive to impress others and had focused instead on what truly mattered: meaningful relationships, personal growth, and authenticity. He wasn't entirely sure what would come next. His career still hovered in the background, like an unfinished chapter in his life, but for the first time in years, he wasn't panicking about the next milestone. For the first time, he was content just being, a concept he had long ago forgotten in the chaos of his ambition. But one thing Steve had learned over the past month was that change doesn't just impact you, it impacts everyone around you. It's a ripple, spreading out from the core of who you are, touching those you love, and sometimes, even strangers you've never met. He was sitting in a cafe, sipping his coffee and catching up on a book, when his phone buzzed with a notification. A new email, marked as urgent, appeared in his inbox. Hesitant but curious, Steve opened it. It was from a high-profile producer in Hollywood. Subject: Keanu Reeves project. Let's talk? Steve, I hope this finds you well. I've seen the viral video from the flight, and I wanted to reach out. Your story about Keanu's response to your initial confrontation has struck a chord with me. We're currently working on a documentary project about the unexpected lessons that celebrities and ordinary people share, and we believe your unique experience could make a powerful contribution to the narrative. Would love to discuss this further. Best regards, Matthew Clark, producer, The Ripple Effect Project. Steve sat there in stunned silence, the email burning through his brain. Was this for real? Was he seriously being contacted by a major producer, asking him to share his side of the story for a documentary? He took a deep breath and clicked reply. Subject: Keanu Reeves project. Let's talk? Matthew, I must admit, I'm surprised to hear from you. Thank you for reaching out. I'd be happy to discuss this further. Best, Steve. Within minutes, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was upbeat and friendly. Steve, great to hear back from you. I'm Matthew Clark. We've been following your story since the video went viral, and we think your perspective is something people need to hear. I'm really excited about this potential collaboration. Steve wasn't sure what to make of it all, but something about Matthew's energy was contagious. And there was something oddly fitting about this turn of events. After everything that had happened, after all the turmoil and revelations, perhaps the most unexpected outcome was the possibility of using his story to make a larger impact. I have to be honest with you, Steve said, running a hand through his hair. I never imagined that an embarrassing moment on a flight would lead to something like this. But I'm intrigued. What exactly are you envisioning for this project? Matthew explained that the documentary would focus on personal growth, the hidden lessons celebrities and everyday people could teach each other, and how those lessons sometimes come from the most unlikely encounters. The goal was to share inspiring stories of overcoming adversity, not just about the famous faces in Hollywood, but about how normal people, like Steve, had been impacted by their experiences with them. Steve's heart raced. He wasn't a public speaker. He wasn't an influencer. He wasn't even sure how much he had to say. But there was something undeniable in the way the conversation flowed, something that made him feel like maybe he did have a story worth telling. By the end of the call, Matthew was eager to move forward, and Steve was left wondering if this could be the next chapter in his life, the one that would take him somewhere beyond the confines of his previous ambitions. Later that week, Steve found himself walking into the film studio for an initial meeting. He was greeted by a team of documentary filmmakers, all ready to start piecing together the story of his unexpected journey. There was a sense of camaraderie that Steve hadn't expected, a mutual understanding that these were people who valued authenticity over spectacle and who believed in the power of real stories. Matthew led him to a small studio room where a camera and a couple of lights were set up. It felt surreal. He wasn't just meeting with an assistant or a public relations team anymore. This was real. "So, Steve, tell us how everything began," Matthew prompted. Steve sat down in front of the camera. He took a deep breath, the weight of everything that had happened crashing down on him in that moment. He realized that this wasn't just an interview. It was an opportunity to reflect on his transformation. He could finally articulate the shift inside him, the lessons he'd learned, and how it had all started with that one embarrassing encounter on a plane. "Honestly, it started with a mistake," Steve began, his voice steady as he looked into the camera. "I was caught up in this idea of success, chasing validation from people who don't even know me. And then I met Keanu, and I acted like a complete jerk. But what I learned from that moment was that the way we respond to others, the way we treat people, is what truly matters. It's not about proving anything to anyone. It's about being authentic, about finding peace within yourself." Matthew and the crew exchanged glances, clearly moved by Steve's words. "You know," Steve continued, "I've spent my whole life trying to chase something that I thought would make me happy. But the truth is, the real happiness comes from being present, being true to yourself, and learning from the people you meet along the way. Keanu, he taught me that. Without even saying a word, he showed me that there's strength in letting go. And that's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." By the time the interview wrapped up, Steve felt lighter than he had in years. He wasn't just telling his story anymore. He was embracing it. He had finally found his voice, and it was far stronger than any public accolade or award could ever make him feel. A few weeks later, the documentary, The Ripple Effect, premiered at a private screening. Steve watched from the back of the room as his story played out on screen, surrounded by a sea of faces. The words that had felt so vulnerable when he first spoke them now rang true and powerful in the context of a larger narrative. When the credits rolled, the room fell silent for a moment. Then, the applause began, soft at first, then building. Steve's heart swelled with gratitude. He had shared something real, something raw, and in return, it had touched others in a way he never imagined. For Steve, it wasn't just about what had happened. It was about the journey, the growth, the lessons, and the people he had met along the way. As he left the screening that night, his mind was clear, his heart full. This was the beginning of something much greater than he could have ever predicted. And for the first time, Steve knew that whatever came next, he was ready for it. The morning after the screening, Steve sat in his favorite coffee shop, the one he'd frequented for years but had never really seen in the way he did now. The familiar buzz of conversation, the clink of coffee cups, and the distant hum of city life outside all seemed to carry a different weight. It was as though he had finally become attuned to the present moment, rather than constantly racing toward the next. As Steve sipped his coffee, he reflected on everything that had led to this point. His life, once defined by ambition and the need for external validation, now felt like it was unfolding in ways he couldn't have planned for. From the unexpected flight encounter with Keanu to his involvement in the documentary, everything had turned upside down, but in the best way possible. The phone buzzed, pulling Steve from his thoughts. It was a message from Mark. "Hey Steve, saw the documentary. Man, you killed it. That story, about Keanu, about the whole transformation. Honestly, I'm proud of you. You've come a long way. So, what's next? Are you planning to keep going with this? I know the world's a little different now, but I'm sure you've got more in store. Steve smiled as he read the message. Mark had always been supportive, even when Steve had been too caught up in the chase to notice it. And now, Mark was right. There was a world of possibilities ahead of him. He typed out a quick reply. Thanks, man. Honestly, I'm not sure what's next, but I'm learning to trust the journey. Life's got a funny way of showing you what you need when you're open to it. I think I'm just going to keep listening and see where it leads. But whatever comes, I know it's going to be about something more meaningful. I've got a few ideas brewing, but I'm in no rush. Just taking things one step at a time. Steve paused for a moment, reading the message over again. Something had shifted in him. He no longer needed the rush, the constant pursuit. It was as if he'd found an inner peace that allowed him to breathe, to live fully, instead of existing for the next goal. The pressure had lifted. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unexpected source, Keanu. Steve, I watched the documentary last night. It was great. I'm glad you're taking the time to reflect on what matters. If you ever need to talk more or just want to meet up, let me know. I'm always around. A sense of gratitude washed over Steve as he read those words. Keanu, the man who had quietly taught him the most profound lesson, was reaching out, not because of a shared moment of fame or spectacle, but because he recognized the journey Steve was on. Steve hesitated for only a moment before typing back. Thanks, Keanu. That means a lot to me. I really appreciate everything you taught me. More than you probably know. I think I'm finally figuring things out. Let's definitely catch up soon. Would love to chat more. As Steve sent the message, he realized how much he had changed. He was no longer that man on the flight, desperate, angry, trying to prove something to the world. He had grown, and the people who had crossed his path, Keanu, Mark, even the people watching his story, had all played their part in shaping that change. The thought of catching up with Keanu in person didn't feel daunting or intimidating anymore. It felt like the next natural step. It wasn't about fame or public perception or what anyone expected of him. It was about two people connecting, sharing stories, and maybe even learning more from each other. Steve had come to understand that life wasn't about trying to control every outcome, but about embracing the moments as they came. As the morning wore on, Steve took a moment to appreciate the stillness around him. He looked out at the people passing by, lost in their own worlds, and wondered how many of them were also on their own journeys of self-discovery. The world was full of stories, full of lessons waiting to be learned. For Steve, this was just the beginning. He had learned that real success wasn't about reaching a destination. It was about the growth that happened along the way. And as long as he kept moving forward, trusting himself and the people who crossed his path, he would always be on the right track. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in his life, Steve felt ready for whatever came next. He finished his coffee, stood up, and walked out into the bright morning sun, his heart lighter than it had ever been. The world was wide open, full of possibility, and Steve was ready to take it all in.